Thanks so much, Mary, for the introduction. Lovely to be back at the Grad Center. We were joking around before we started that I actually was never a CPCP fellow, but I had like an administrative fellowship at CPCP and got to sit in the background and bask in all of the brilliance that was happening while I just made event announcements on WordPress. So welcome to from Upscaling to Uhauling, Perspectives on Black Queer Gentrification. As Mary said, my name is Desiree Fields. I'm an urban and economic geographer. I'm based at UC Berkeley, and I am so delighted and happy to be here with Jack Gieseking and Brandi Summers. Jack is one of my most longtime colleagues. He was in the cohort that was 1 year ahead of me in environmental psych at the grad center. So we both got our PhDs around the same time, and maybe in the same year in 2013. And Brandi is one of my newest colleagues and co-conspirators. We were both actually hired into geography and global metropolitan studies at UC Berkeley at the same time. So starting our own little cohort. And so I can see in the participant list lots of familiar names and faces today, but I will take a moment to briefly and more formally introduce Jack and Brandi. So Jack Gieseking is an urban and digital cultural geographer and environmental psychologist. They are assistant professor of geography at the University of Kentucky. His first monograph, A Queer New York, Geographies of Lesbians, Dykes, and Queers, 1983 to 2008, was published by NYU Press last year. And the book is a historical geography of contemporary lesbian queer society and economies in New York City. Brandi Summers is assistant professor of geography and global metropolitan studies at the University of California, Berkeley. Her first book, Black in Place, The Spatial Aesthetics of Race in a Post-Chocolate City, came out on UNC Press in 2019. And the book demonstrates how competing notions of Blackness structure economic relations and develop land in the gentrifying city. Both of these scholars have like much more extensive biographies that I could have shared with you, but I think like we all are aware of how brilliant they are and how accomplished they are. So I'm just going to move on to tell you a little bit about the event. Today's event celebrates the work of these two wonderful scholars whose books examine the politics of gentrification as they play out across race, class, gender, and sexuality. In A Queer New York, Gieseking theorizes queer productions of space beyond the gayborhood to confront how New York's lesbian and queer communities have been both displaced by the city's rapid gentrification, but have also contributed to that process. In Black in Place, Summers explores how the aesthetics of Blackness are mobilized to facilitate processes of gentrification that work to displace Black people, according value to Blackness in cities, while not according that value to actual Black life. And so today we'll have a chance to hear Jack and Brandi, and also my 3-year-old in the background. We'll have a chance to hear Jack and Brandi discuss their work and what it tells us about the politics of gentrification and the possibilities for more equitable cities. Their comments will set the scene for a conversation about the similarities, differences, and incommensurabilities between their queer New York and the post-chocolate city, their participants, and the processes of gentrification in the late 20th and early 21st century US cities. So welcome Brandi and Jack and everyone else. Very happy to be here with all of you today. The way this event is going to work is we're going to first set the scene by hearing about each of the book projects in a little bit more detail. So each author will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we'll kind of dig into a more kind of in-depth conversation. So Brandi, why don't you go ahead and go first, speaking for about 10 minutes.
Great, thank you, Desiree, and thank you, Mary, and of course, Jack. I am really happy to be here. I'm not an alum, so I'm just kind of like sneaking in and hoping to hang with you all. And actually, I'm just gonna say, this is going to be a casual environment. I didn't want anything anxiety producing, because generally when I'm about to give a talk of some kind, like I zone out and I'm super nervous, and I didn't want to be today. So I'm not, and I just kind of want to have a conversation with my friends. So as Desiree mentioned, I didn't show my book. This is my book, because we decided we're not going to share screens and make you look at images. So at least you can look at the book, and I love my cover. So, all right. Okay. 3 in a row. All right. So The book, Black in Place. So I'm really, for the book, looking at how Blackness is this instrument of race, and it's operated within the context of historical and contemporary contestations over Black place and space. So that's really kind of where I started. I moved to DC without having known that I was going to do this work for my dissertation. And once I decided to pursue a question or these questions about gentrification rather than high fashion imagery, which was the second half of my dissertation, because I realized fashion would be racist forever. And so I figured I would rather look to these kind of changes in the city's makeup, especially as it related to Washington, DC at this point, right? And so really for the book, I'm talking about the ways that Blackness ends up figuring into processes and practices of urban gentrification. And in particular, I'm looking at the role of race generally, but Blackness in particular, as an aesthetic of the H Street Northeast corridor, for those of you who are familiar with DC. But for those who aren't, it's a historically Black and rapidly gentrified commercial district in DC. And really in the book, I'm talking about how there was this shift from DC being this chocolate city to a more diverse and cosmopolitan metropolis. So in particular, I'm really looking at the role, or at least the changing historical role of Blackness and its interaction with these processes, right? I'm really saying that a small space is going to be instructive for how we can think about this wider story about cultural change, racial conflict, various capital flows, governance, and then again, gentrification. And so I'm really, for me, H Street really perfectly illustrated this problem that emerges when Black areas end up being primed for revitalization. So again, I was looking at gentrification around on and around H Street to really think about how Blackness ended up going from this set of political commitments that were rooted in the preservation of Black life to this aesthetic that ends up being integral to the cultural displacement and material dispossession of Black people. And so I'm using Blackness as the analytic, right, to understand how racism shapes Black life and how these liberal proclamations of, race neutrality, which we start to see, especially in the time period after President Barack Obama was first elected, and then even in his second term, race neutrality and these calls for diversity ended up only serving to marginalize and displace Black people, specifically in DC. So really, I'm arguing that Blackness ends up being simultaneously pathologized, celebrated, and sanitized for capital, and ends up being subsumed under this capital-friendly umbrella of diversity. And so what I'm really calling this aesthetic infrastructure of gentrification is the way that the always familiar craft brew masters and cupcake bakers and various high-end eateries, as well as city planners and corporate retailers, all end up deploying this aesthetics of Blackness to help landmark and brand spaces around their investments. So what this means is I'm conceding the historical. Oh, there we go. I'm conceding this historical tie between Blackness and race. And really the routine allowed me to take this opportunity to see something that ends up being laden with politics, like urban development, and look at it through this series of well-manicured projections of Blackness that again take on the appearance of race neutrality. So the bigger question I was really trying to figure out is like how, at first, diversity is being discursively sutured to this neighborhood to really produce a brand new spatial identity. When I was in grad school, I read a lot of Stuart Hall, and he talked about how identities end up operating as these points of identification and attachment, mainly because their capacity to end up excluding, leave out and render outside, right? And so I was really trying to figure out, as Stuart Hall was wondering, about the excesses. And I wondered what happened to the marginal excesses of Blackness in the nation's first chocolate city that don't end up fitting into revised stories about a city's multicultural past, which often happens, right? And so I'm also considering how these demands of urban change make the marginal excesses both possible and necessary for the spread of gentrification. So like, you know, the too muchness of Blackness in the city, but also this difference, that difference as diversity or diversity as difference ends up being necessary in the shifting urban terrain. So a lot of people ask me like, why chocolate or why post chocolate? And so some people might be familiar with other, you know, culinary metaphors that have been used to discuss the changes in DC, like lattes and cappuccinos and s'mores even, to describe the changing demographics and this signal to a shift to whiteness. But for me, post chocolate ended up being more of an open-ended term. And so the term doesn't necessarily guess what color or colors are next. DC absolutely is an international city. And so the divide between Black and white becomes more complicated. So I didn't want to speak about this shift to white when I knew that Blackness still existed in meaningful ways in this post-chocolate city context. So, you know, just generally, theoretically, how I'm understanding what's going on, I introduced this theory, Black aesthetic and placement, which really I'm talking about this mode of representing the realities of Blackness with various representations. And so usually like when I give a talk, I'd show like images of what that could look like. And so in some cases, I tell a story in the book about this chocolate display in Whole Foods, because yes, of course, there's a Whole Foods in the neighborhood. And the display is called Chocolate City. And it's where Whole Foods is selling a whole bunch of really expensive chocolates. So just thinking about the experience of walking into a gentrified neighborhood, seeing a Whole Foods, which at the time hadn't been owned by Amazon yet, but walk in and right next to the organic produce, you start to see Chocolate City with this, you know, milk chocolate sky scene that's supposed to be this generic, you know, scape. Like, what am I saying? You know, this cityscape, the buildings. Anyway, it wasn't DC, right? So it becomes this generic place where Chocolate City ends up being a generic skyline. Thank you, Desiree. This generic skyline that was clearly not DC, but again, in this gentrifying context. So we're starting to see examples like this popping up all around the city, in addition to more mundane examples where there are planning opportunities, honestly, for the government to find ways to invite creative industries to come to a commercial district and instead really push out Black-owned barbershops and beauty shops at the same time. So in thinking about Black aesthetic and placement, I'm thinking about how Blackness ends up being aestheticized in order to bolster these different landscapes and to foster capital. But it ends up happening through a more hegemonic capitalist structuring and signifying of different notions of Blackness, really to make people want to come to the area. And so it's strategic, though, in this incorporation. It doesn't happen necessarily at all times in all areas. So again, you know, we're gonna have a lovely talk, but I'm really thinking about 8th Street as this really powerful example of how it joins this larger geographic landscape of the city and really how to think about what urban means today. So on 8th Street, you know, revitalization ends up opening up the neighborhood to transition from this container of deviancy, is how it would seem before, to this corridor that links the economic engines of society. And so the racialization of this space ends up being a way that uneven development takes place and is also justified at the same time. So again, you know, I think ultimately with the project itself, I'm looking at DC, which was, you know, the nation's first large majority Black city, the Chocolate City. And it really ends up being analogous to so many cities that experienced racism, segregation, and continue to, high unemployment, disproportionate incarceration rates, but then also beautiful culture, music, food, politics, and various modes of play. And so this transition of the area absolutely exemplifies the decimation of a Black city. It's this disappearing mode of social and cultural life that ends up being revised and remade by an aesthetic infrastructure. And so for me, the book ends up exposing the contours of contemporary racism, and it provides a framework through which to imagine these different ways to study the dismantling, and then hopefully the eventual reclamation of the Black city. So my next research project is looking at Oakland, my hometown, which drives a lot of my interest in understanding the dimensions of gentrification, but specifically how Black a city is seen, certainly, and what that does in terms of people's consumption of it. So I'll stop there. Go ahead, Jack.
I wish I had gone first because that was really brilliant. Okay, so Desi, did you want to say something?
No, I mean, I'm just like always struck by the ways that your projects like overlap and diverge. And I was like just thinking about how Brandi's project is like focusing in on this one small place and thinking about how that place got kind of like opened up to the like economic engine of the rest of the city, and how your project is like just much more expansive geographically in the sense that you're focusing, you focus in on particular neighborhoods, but you're also focusing on like kind of a citywide scale. And I was just thinking about, yeah, like that particular divergence, but we'll talk about that later. Go ahead, Jack.
Hi, I'm Jack. I want to thank so many of mine and Desi's faculty and so many of all of our friends for being here. That's really amazing. My book, actually, like the idea of what it was all came together. Don Mitchell was giving a little talk and about the Bracero book, and he said, what is the Bracero function to capital? And I was like, oh my gosh, what is the lesbian queer function to capital as it relates to the city? And it was just this massive shift. I want to be honest, I was too afraid to do political economy, even though I was studying with people like Cindy Katz. And I had the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics Fellowship. Thank you all so much, with David, Harvey, and so many other, thanks everyone to my cohort in that too. So I was interested in really, how could you go from AIDS to the L word in 25 years? And that just really struck me, and what happened to lesbian queer spaces. I decided to interview 47 self-identified lesbians and queers who came out between 83 and 08, which is that period. And we did multi-generational focus groups and mental maps of spaces and places important to them when they were coming out, and they brought really cool artifacts around the time they're coming out. And I also spent a year doing archival research at the Lesbian History Archives over in Brooklyn. And really, I made some maps from them. I'll put those links in there too. But the thing that really struck me and what guided the structure of the book was that all my participants, when I asked them what a lesbian and or queer space was, and those are the words they used to identify, so those are the words I'm going to use for them, and they are women and trans and gender nonconforming people, was that they would talk about neighborhoods, and then they would say, well, a neighborhood doesn't really work for me. And we could go through any neighborhood in New York City and talk about why, but the three or the four that came up the most by far were Greenwich Village, of course, the home of the Stonewall Rebellion in 1869, Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights in Brooklyn, and also Park Slope. And I saw Tamar Rothenberg is here, and I hope you liked the chapter, because it wouldn't have existed in such a way without your beautiful work. So the thing that I found across with this notion of this neighborhood that doesn't actually support LGBTQ people is what I call the myth of neighborhood liberation. So this ethnic enclave model where by owning property and creating commerce that you are deserving of rights and respect and citizenship in the city. And again, deviancy then gets rewritten out of the script in the 2000s with the marriage and military movement. And when it comes to Greenwich Village, I talked very much about how this was this Oz that everyone envisions as this ideal place, this tourist hub from around the world where LGBTQ people, especially women, trans, gender nonconforming, Black, Indigenous, Latinx people can visit but not stay, and how it's their bodies that create the money and the tourism and are a staple to the city. If you've heard anything about lesbians recently, you probably heard that we have less than 20 bars in the United States and not that many more in the entire world. 3 of them are in New York City. 2 of them are actually in Greenwich Village. And I wasn't shocked that they stayed open because they're a major get for the city, right? Even though I haven't found any lesbian bar, heard of any lesbian bar that got a small business association loan. There are all these loopholes where no queer spaces seems to have gotten them. from the Trump administration, surprise, that those are still open is really poignant. In the Bed-Stuy Crown Heights chapter, I was really interested in what one of my participants called Where the Girls Go, and how Blackness and is shaped by and limited to neighborhoods like Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights, where these spaces away from dominant white spaces and middle-class spaces, and the limits to those spaces in terms of refuge for my participants. And then in the final, the fourth neighborhood chapter, Park Slope, I was really interested in building from Tamar's work about, how did like a women's neighborhood ever exist in New York City? My participants were really obsessed with why Park Slope is no longer a lesbian neighborhood. But the more I listened to them, the more I realized it was a freaking miracle that there was a women's neighborhood in the middle of New York City ever. Like, that's wild, right? That's just absolutely crazy. And now it's this neighborhood of mothers, which you have these kind of like neutral looking older lesbians and like increased number of women who were able to buy there a long time ago. And I talk a lot about how not only whiteness and middle classness helped to gentrify this neighborhood, but also education and those privileges. And also how that gentrification, how these women and trans people have been certainly pushed out of that neighborhood. One of my participants made the joke that there were no more neighborhoods for them to gentrify and they would soon be in the water, talking about Jamaica Bay. And that's definitely something that happened. I was really worried when I did the research that if I published about how lesbians and queers love a yoga and a brunch and everything that Brandi talks about in her book, and a community supported agriculture, and they build the community garden and they fix the playground. And you can think about Ditmas Park as property values, doubled and tripled in the span of a few years. Actually, one of my participants fixed the playground, got the lot fixed to become a community garden, and brought the community supported agriculture in, and was really devoted to the anti-racist yoga space, Third Root, over there. And that's the outcome of that, thinking that they're making this community, and how that was manipulated by the real estate state, Hasty Amstein. And throughout the book, I offer this idea of constellations. So if neighborhoods fail, how are lesbian queer spaces produced? And I found that they were much more fragmented and fleeting. And like stars in the sky. I actually came up with this in Cindy Katz's office with Cindy Katz. Hi, Cindy Katz. And she was like, "Is it archipelagos?" And actually, Gaziani writes about archipelagos, and a couple other people do. But I was like, no, like it goes out, right? It's not like the water comes up and down over the land, but like that star goes out, but the light still comes to you. And it was more like a star in the sky. We thought about constellations, and if these women and trans people's bodies moving through space that knit them together. And for me, constellations is really another way to think about a marginalized production of space, and a really kind of turn your frown upside down, because most of my participants really felt bad that they couldn't hang on to these spaces. They also felt bad that they had gentrified. They were very careful and talked openly about white women and trans people not gentrifying Black spaces, but had no awareness whatsoever that they had gentrified so many Latinx spaces. Like Park Slope was once a third Latinx. And yeah, I think so. One thing that also I was excited about in the book was that Brandi asked me as a start off, and I can use this to maybe segue, was like, I put some of my personal narrative in it. And actually, I would say first that my editor made me do it, and my ex made me do it. Like, they're just like, you should be in this book. And I think, in writing this book, as a trans person, as a lesbian, as a queer, like, who is writing this history, right? I think there's a lot of that. And I know that your story about Oakland comes at the end, Brandi, which is like in high school. And it's like, oh yeah, like my heart just like, yeah, opens up. And it really does. It was like, how much should I tell you? And I just thought my experiences weren't very cool. Like, I was just so awkward. I never knew it. I always felt like I didn't know what I was doing when I went to these spaces. And I always showed up when they were closing. I always thought like I missed something. And then I realized that was lesbian queer life, like this sensation of it's closed now, it's closed now. And the fewer spaces that you have, and these notions, I was also really writing against this notion that there's an assimilation of lesbian and gays. For me, Amin Ghaziani's book about the gayborhood, that gays and lesbians were just assimilating was like agonizing to me, and is absolutely not what my participants can do. They can't really afford to choose where they live. They're not wanting to move to the suburbs, and they're critically trying to be part of social change. And as much as they understand that, there's also this attachment to this, what I call dyke politics. And we're well known for our potlucks and protests. I also say that in the book. So for me, it was trying to, I wrote the book that I really wanted to read, that I wish had been there all along. I was once sitting at the Lesbian History Archives, and I got up to check a date, and then I realized that book didn't exist. And then I was really freaked out that I wrote it. And I think at the Grad Center, I probably told dozens of people that I realized I was writing the first lesbian history of New York in an effort to get someone else to write that book. Like, I prayed very hard that I would not be that book. But I hope that it does some of that work to hold lesbians and queers accountable for their role in gentrification. And there are definitely participants in my work who knew how hurtful and violent gentrification was, and then also how it took away the stamp of deviance and violence against queer bodies. And we're torn in that. Okay, so I'll stop there and we can start jamming.
Awesome. Thanks to both of you. You were also both very timely, which I appreciate very much. Jack actually started to talk a little bit about one of the questions that I wanted to, just to kind of get your takes on. So as we were talking in the lead up to this event, we were talking about like the choices about like whether and how to bring your own narratives into your books. Both of you like have clear personal connections to the politics of gentrification that you address in your research, but you did make different choices about how much this was part of the book. And so Jack, you talked a little bit just now about how you consciously wrote yourself into the book. And Brandi, you didn't do this as much, although you do touch on your experiences growing up in Oakland at the end of Black in Place. And so I guess for Jack, I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about what you feel writing yourself into the book brought to the account, or like what would have been missing if you weren't there as much. And Brandi, knowing that your next book is about your hometown, how are you thinking about weaving yourself into that project or not?
So there's this story that I tell about going to Doc Holliday's on Avenue A, right off of Tompkins Square Park. And what I left out is there used to be a woman in a leather lycra bustier that if you played The Devil Went Down to Georgia and danced on the bar, it was like a biker cowboy weird bar. And it was a women's night on Monday, and it was free. And the lesbians took over, right? The rugby team came with the softball team, with all the softball teams, with this like, and this like a wild experience of this space where there were so many people of so many different backgrounds, which is so rare. And I was very tipsy, and someone said, "Do you want to go to a tea party?" Like, well, and I said, "Oh my God, I love Earl Grey." And they're like, "Yeah, you didn't get it." That I'm being invited to like an underground hormone exchange in 2002. And I'm like, phew. And I think I put that story in to be like, I seem like an authoritative voice, but I was just like you. Right? Like, I also have this sense, because all of my participants had this sense, like, how do we do this? And like hundreds of people have come up to me in my life and say, do you think I'm gay enough? And I'm like, I just look like this. I have no idea I'm sure you're doing a great job. And so like, there's a lot, like, there's like wanting to say to people, this is the best I can do. Like, we're all finding our way together. And there's a lot of time I admit things I didn't understand. And yeah, so that was something I really wanted to bring up, because it's something that I was worried about making it too finite and definite.
So it's partly about like kind of bringing in a different audience to your work and making like your work is like clearly like you're engaging with all kinds of scholarship, like you're producing important intellectual work, but in bringing yourself into the book, it seems like it was also about like making your work accessible to like your everyday queer rather than
yeah. I mean, I like lesbians and queers read books about lesbians and queers. Like, people are going to find this, and I wanted them to feel seen. Like, I tried to mention every kind of possible lesbian queer like, I call them archetypes, right? Like the softball and the granola, and, you know, like I wanted them all to like just have a mention of something to not be written out of. And then putting myself in is to say, yeah, like it's hard to be vulnerable. It's like, I didn't know how to, like, I was finding my way too. Like these are, and also I think there's a lot of moments of saying like, wow, these are realizations. There was a really powerful moment in my research that where it was a multi-generational group, and a woman who came out in '84 and these women who came out in the '90s knows we're talking. And the woman from '84, she said, when I got evicted, and the women from the '90s knows said, oh, why'd you get evicted? And she's like, because I was gay. And it was this massive breakdown in the group interview. And later in the separate groups, the women from the '90s knows were like, oh my God, I'm so embarrassed. I didn't know, I'm so embarrassed. And I was like, we don't know. How would you know that 1987, the law, who teaches you this? Where is your gay history? Like that is not what you learned in high school or college. That nobody knows that. I didn't know that till she told us. And then the woman from '84 was like, these kids today think it's all like the L word. And I think there's so little queer history. Like I have like undergrads write me and they're like, I'm gonna get your book soon. I'm like, here's a PDF. You know, like, you know, let queer history should be free. Like there's not enough of it. Yeah, so I think that was really important too. I mean, it starts with these blue star tattoos that like women have like all over the world, and realizing like, oh my God, there's like most lesbian history is based on buffalo from the 1930s to the 60s, boots of leather, slippers of gold. And it was like, oh my freaking God, we're reading one book and we think buffalo is the world. And so like, it's trying to open that up.
That's beautiful.
So I kind of just want to sit and listen to Jack, but all right. That's a really great question, because I think we're coming from these opposite perspectives. I'm a Capricorn. I don't personalize anything. So I think it's very much
Jack is a Leo.
Yeah, we're Leos. We wanted to out ourselves to you right now. We're Leos. We love you as Leos.
So that's so besides that, because thinking about constellations in astrology anyway, but really honestly, I think in a lot of ways, the way my approach to the book, which was my approach to the dissertation, is that I don't belong here, and that's academia. I didn't know how to do academia. I did not follow the proper path. I didn't know what I was doing half the time. So in producing a book, it was really kind of like, okay, what do I have to do next? I can't put my personal story into it because, you know, my family didn't go to college, so they certainly didn't have graduate degrees. And so no one could guide me into what I was supposed to be doing. And I thought all of my questions were dumb. And so if that was the case, I just had to keep reading until I figured out what I was supposed to do. So if I put myself into the book, that would require me to do some kind of excavation that I didn't have the tools to do. So I'd rather turn the lens around and really kind of be someone who could blend in the background. And so honestly, for me to be in a Black city and to be a Black woman, it was easy for me to just kind of sit down and watch people do their thing. And people like to talk to me, and I just talked to them back. And I got so many incredible stories just by being a guest in this city. And then now a lot of people could figure I was from California somehow, but still they wanted to talk. And so I still could dig into the archives. I was originally trained as a historian. And so I thought I could just kind of hang out in the DC Public Library in the stacks. But, you know, there were ways that these questions brought me out of it. So still, my inspiration for the work in DC had a lot to do with what I had seen going on in the San Francisco Bay Area, but namely what was going on in Oakland. And these ways that, though, you know, depending on whose account you look at, whether Oakland actually became majority Black or not, it was still seen as this Black city. And growing up in the 80s and 90s and watching the local and national news and just knowing that it was just a murder city. And, you know, everyone thought, I mentioned this in another talk, but I ran track. And so everyone thought we were gangbangers because we came from Oakland when we came off of our bus. And so there are these ways that Oakland had been figured as this Black city. And I knew that was similar to DC. So I used that experience to get me to enter the space. But that did not mean I was supposed to attach my own personal history to the story. The why I want to come back and do work on Oakland now is honestly because I love a challenge. And so I am scared out of my gourd to actually write something that has any kind of personal connection to the work, but I also can't help it. So what it's required me to do is talk to my family about stuff and talk to them about the things that they never wanted to talk to me about, and talk to me about sacrifices that were made, or who went to jail because they were hanging out with the Panthers, or who was, who moved into this neighborhood and snuck under the cover of night. How, when we moved from Louisiana, that it was because my step great grandfather whistled at a white woman and so they had to leave town. I didn't know this stuff. And so I'm adding that to this textured story that I'm hoping I can write. I mean, I really don't know if I can write this book. So with DC, I could distance it enough from me in order to produce something, and also to focus more on structure. Trained as a sociologist, but still in a very heterodox program at Santa Cruz, I was able to, and seeing like Sharon Zukin here is freaking me out, but to be able to look at structure and to understand how I didn't necessarily have to incorporate my personal story in order to tell this story about Blackness that was so important to me. So we'll see what happens. I don't know how Oakland's going to pan out in terms of the work. I really don't. I mean, Desiree's helping with the work that we're doing together, but I still have not put myself in that work at all. So,
I mean, it's so interesting because I feel like both of you are talking about like a kind of like a politics of vulnerability and expertise, but it's playing out in like super divergent ways. It's really fascinating.
Well, and part of that too, I mean, it's training, right? And so again, this weird navigation history, then I went to political science and worked a little bit with Kathy Cohen, and like that all blew my mind. Like I can't do political science, so I quit. And then, just thinking I was gonna go at Melissa Harris, she was Lacewell then, and Perry now, working with them and like being freaked out in that department and knowing, again, I did not belong. And so I was trying, Iris Young was alive. I mean, it was just a lot going on in that department that freaked me out. It was so overwhelming. And that was the other thing. I felt like I had to distance myself in order to do that important work. But you're right, there's a level of vulnerability that was necessary even to be there and to finish and to write and to really kind of feel it. So yeah.
But there's these times where you say, I struck up this conversation with a homeless person. There's these times where you show up and then you realize, like, it kind of like came in on me, like, you're everywhere. You're reading every document. You're on the streets all the time. You can tell us about the minutia of what's changing. And then this was this percentage and this moved. And I'm like, whoa, like that you were like saturated in it. It was really powerful. Like your methods, yeah, they were just fantastic. Like I could feel the city and I could like understand the change in your arguments. It was so vibrant.
Thank you. That means a lot.
Sharon, and I think that
you guys are both methods obsessed.
Oh, we are? How fun.
Oh yeah, yes. That's right. Yes, you can talk.
I want to transition a little bit. I mean, I love this conversation, but I want to transition a little bit to some of the more like conceptual stuff that jumped out at me in reading and like rereading both of your work. And one of the things that really stood out to me was how you're both working with ideas of precarity in relation to urban change and political economy. So like Brandi, you talk about precarity as kind of like an emotional, kind of like affective experience, to talk about how gentrification isn't just physical displacement, but it's also this like state of existence of like not knowing what's going to come next, which reminds me a lot of this recent paper by Laura Wynn and Dallas Rogers, where they talk about in-place displacement and this idea of how like as the neighborhood is changing around you, your whole experience of like space, culture, everything, like all of your experiences of place change, even if like you're still literally in the same neighborhood. And then Jack, you talk about Uhauling. For those of you who don't know, it's the tendency for lesbians and queers to move in together pretty quickly after starting a relationship, or this idea of like bringing a U-Haul on a second date. And Jack, you link this spatial practice of U-Hauling to the economic precarity experienced by lesbians and queer people. So Brandi's talking about precarity as in a kind of affective way. Jack, I feel like you're talking about it as kind of like a spatial, like, you know, something that like, you know, is productive of this spatial practice of Uhauling. But I'd love to just hear you both expand on how the idea of precarity operates in your work and in the processes of urbanization that you're looking at.
That's a great question.
You start.
That's fine. So that's a great question. I think that, you know, as it related to that affective experience, it really had a lot to do with, Saidiya Hartman talks about staying, like where you stay. So not like where your house is, not, you know, where you live, but it's where do you stay? And that was something that's been important to me in understanding what Black life is in DC. And so where you stay is where you sleep, where you live, where your family might be. But at the same time, the city itself had this way of being home. It had this, as it related to culture, in terms of music, in terms of food, in terms of just knowing how to navigate the city, right? It's sometimes impossible to navigate that city sometimes. And so the precarity of not knowing where you stay anymore was really central to me understanding this kind of displacement. And so many people were focusing on, or scholars and even students, as I was talking to them about displacement, right? So there had been plenty of studies that had talked about cultural, physical displacement, various forms of displacement. But literally to know what it feels like to not belong anymore was something that was really central. And so I would see people who would literally come and just hang out on the street corner where they used to stay. They didn't live in the region any longer, but just to come back, just to hang there and to be able to incorporate that into an analysis about how violent it is when there are various processes that the government, that developers are advocating to make it so you don't feel like you stay anywhere anymore. So I think that the precarity that I'm talking about in the book is more about that, and not necessarily trying to operationalize it, but at least to get people to understand how it feels when you don't know where you stay anymore, and to not take that for granted, especially as oftentimes policy is used to determine where people should move, but again, not how to get them to be where they feel they belong.
Wow, thanks. Yeah, I think I thought that Uhauling was just a really funny joke, like what does a lesbian take on a second date? And then and one of my participants like handled me and was like, do you know how hard it is to be queer in the city, and you are so alone, and you finally find someone who understands you and you want to make a world with them away from everyone else? And I was like, oh yeah, I do. Actually, I do. You're so right. And realizing, George Chauncey had written in Gay New York, public privacy could only be had in public. And, for lesbians, privacy can only be had in private. It's not like they let women, white women, especially middle-class women, the number of women who could go out on the street who were then attacked, especially like Black women, like thinking again about Hartman's Beautiful Wayward Lives and Beautiful Experiments. Everyone should read that book a million times. And how it was to, try to find a place to make a home, and thinking about these, queer communes that pop up where people pay very little, but how annoyed they get with their roommates like very quickly because it's so stressful, and everyone is also dealing with so many stressors. Like, how am I going to fund top surgery? And how am I going to deal with my parents who don't talk to me? And I think that it was something I hadn't thought about, the precarity of like queer home life, although that came up so much more, where home spaces and apartment spaces and how important they were as a queer space. And I think also about the precarity that I was also shocked how much my participants blamed themselves, right? That goes back to the neighborhood thing, that the inability to stay put, that they hadn't lived up to something, to some kind of queer version of the American dream, that was really sad to me. And I wanted them to be angry and not self-blaming. And I think that was also something I really wrote into the book, that this precarity is, and Linda Johnson's written some beautiful pieces in Progress in Human Geography about precarity. I recommend those. She's just fabulous, queer feminist geographer. Yeah, I also think there's like a cosmopolitanism that like that New York City, this is what the next book's going to be about. after this, I'm writing a little book on dyke bars, but after like is like really thinking about how the lesbian and like Brandi's work is like so key to this, is like a signifier cosmopolitanism, like especially like L word lesbians, right? They're all feminine. There's total colorism. You know, there's 2 Black women. They're very light skinned. They don't seem to go to work very much, but they make a lot of money. They're running for mayor. I'm very excited. I bet should have been there. And, you know, that would have been actually a great plot line. But like how that kind of, that notion of this like very sexualized cosmopolitan lesbian, like I say at the very end of the book, it wasn't until 2019 when you search the word lesbian, porn didn't come up, right? So pretty much everyone who's like old enough to want to watch us talk right now has, you know, would have lived through that moment of Google and been saturated in what a lesbian is a hypersexualized male like object for the male gaze, or for the other female gaze, you never know, or the they gaze. But I think that kind of realizing what actual power they do have, and how that organizing has been broken up. If you look back in the 1970s, lesbian organizing, they were like on point. And then Lesbian Avengers like really brought it together again and ACT UP. And everyone looks back to those folks, you know, the people who came out in the 2000s and said, I don't really know how to do that. So, and I think that was really enforced by this kind of the assimilationist network, the narratives, you know, the response to Matt Shepard's death, that someone cared about a little white, blonde, blue-haired boy who died, right? In such a brutal way, in a specific way. And, you know, I've heard about like, I think that that shift that happened into the 2000s also had a lot to do with 9/11 in New York. Like Blue Stockings went from being a feminist bookstore to being a radical bookstore. And without that titling, like a lot of people felt like the feminist title really fell away because it threw itself behind the anti-war movement and to other issues of violence and that were happening, and social justice issues. And lesbians love to show up for other people. Like they're, you know, sometimes this is not, they do not put themselves first. They don't understand, and they don't really talk to one another, right? So when I had them all talking to one another, that what constellates is all these injustices that they face and that they navigate and move around. And a lot of my work draws on, I know that you cite Sarah Ahmed a lot, as you also cite Sharon Zukin and Seth Lowe, which is so cool to see, yeah, all of our people. About Sarah Ahmed's like queer phenomenology of orientations, like that what pulls you forward and that what you move away from, like was heavily formative to like how I thought about constellations. So yeah, I think that, and the precarity is like, where are you going to go next? But there's always another space. How long is it going to, you know, it's going to close after, you know, you're 25, you know, you're going to lose it. So but the sense of belonging is always precarious, but then it can go back into the home of something that, you know.
So all of this talk about precarity and the inability to stay put and the disappearance of social and cultural life that is like permeating throughout both of your work, like through my eyes, like in my brain, I'm like, this is about property, right? And I feel like property is, you know, is like so often posed as the, you know, like this is the solution to all of this, right? Like if everyone could just be property owners, they wouldn't have to worry about staying put and being disappeared and so forth. And I mean, you know, as you can guess, like I'm like suspicious of that interpretation, but I just want to hear you kind of talk about like in like from your work, like what are the implications of like your work, the way you interpret, you know, cities, like what are the implications of your work for how we think about property in relation to Black and queer life?
So both Jack and I were shaking our heads when you were mentioning that property, thinking that if everyone just, yeah, no. And so there's a reason why for me, I purposely didn't focus on residential gentrification and thinking about dispossession as it related to people's homes. And part of it, certainly the field was saturated. Even in talking about Washington, DC in particular, there had already been some scholars who were doing that work. I did want to focus on a commercial corridor because I thought what was missing was that affective component where it's like, you can have you can have a house or an apartment, or you can rent, you can own in a neighborhood, but once the commercial area starts shifting, you can't shop there anymore if you can't afford it any longer. And so, or even if you don't live there anymore, you're not going to come back for those services that had previously been there and now have been moved out. And that's especially the case in DC. And so, Desiree, you and I have been writing more recently about Oakland and the fight for Moms for Housing, and thinking about, honestly, what property ownership really means. So it's a contentious topic, especially for Black Americans, for so many reasons. But if we think about even the more recent histories in terms of, folks keep talking about wanting to go back to the New Deal, but the New Deal wasn't all that great for Black people. So, especially as it related to home ownership, or at least access to wealth and the ability to go buy a house in the brand new suburbs. So, So for me, the questions are more around ownership, and than they are necessarily around property, because still, as I think about reclamation, I have to, of course, think about the ways that, Indigenous folk lived there before all of us. And so this isn't necessarily that the property that's being, or at least the concept of property that's being produced, is still a figment. Like, it's something that's made, it's something that's created. It's not something that exists before this imagination and this particular spatial imaginary. So I want, and that's, I think, why there, for me, is this turnabout where people can be. So I've written subsequently about, as I think I mentioned, go-go music, and thinking about the Don't Mute DC movement that occurred in 2019. And that folks in DC, activists in DC, are hoping will remain. But really, it's how sound can permeate, or noise, the designation of noise can permeate and really kind of make space and make place for Black people who have, again, been pushed out. And so it's less about determining what property in terms of a physical structure is, but more so, how do you get people to stay? How can you get people to remain? Too often, some of the conversations get usurped around, build Black wealth so you can buy a house. And generally, we know that we go into these class dimensions. And I will admit, I did not go into class, not nearly enough in my book, and especially thinking about DC, where it has this large Black middle class, but in a lot of ways, it's the same Black middle class that has been exploiting the Black working working class and poor. And so, focusing on property, focusing on ownership and entrepreneurial ventures and public-private partnerships seems to be the way to create this distinction between who deserves and who doesn't, i.e. who belongs and who doesn't. So that's why I think, like, I didn't focus, and I know for you, property ends up being important in those ways, but understanding how Black people have even been banished from their homes, Ananya Roy-esque racial banishment, that it's not the metric that's going to help me figure out how we get free. Like, it's just not going, I think if anything, it's going to possibly limit the stakes, limit the possibilities for us to find another way to operate.
Ooh, I love the way you're like pulling apart ownership from private property. That's gorgeous. I love it. Jack?
Yeah, I was just listening to Brandi, and I forgot I would have to respond there for a second, because it was like, oh yeah, wow, that was amazing. Yeah, I think I'm really glad you brought up property. I just found this master's thesis up in Columbia about a history of lesbian bars from a preservation perspective, and I think in the history of New York City, there's only one lesbian bar where they own the building, and I don't know I don't even know how many people own their buildings across the US, but I would say it's a handful, is my guess. And so there's this idea of a permanence of like a 7 days a week open bar. And that's why there's so many reasons people are fixated on the lesbian bar, but that's one of them, like, to have this place to go. It's also one of the only places you call lesbian, right? It's not a word that gets used. And part of that is a tactic of staying away from cis men, right? And protecting yourself. But I think this idea of property, there's a graph. One day I'll meet the right feminist queer economist to make this graph. But I was thinking, what is it? It's at, like 78 cents in the dollar, and doing all of the, two women living together, right, at $1.50 56, you know, and then showing the graph of how long it would take you to save up to buy something in New York City. Like people who came out in the 80s maybe could buy something by the mid 90s, like on my math. And then, you know, if you came out in the 2000s, you could probably buy something in the 2030s. It matters what happens to the property values right now due to COVID, I think. But yeah, I feel like there's an imaginary that there's some sort of property ownership and placement. And it goes back to like old gay gentrification narratives, like all the way back to Castells, right? Or like the Bob Damron guides that were so popular that, you know, really created for like white middle-class men to wander around and cruise and find one another. And I mean, obviously I know I have been there for all of your work, Desi, so I've thought about your stuff through my stuff. And how, I don't know, like, I think it's crushing and sad. Like, again, it's about ownership. Like it's just not going to happen. And, you know, like capitalism is really patriarchal and it's really cisgender and it's really heterosexual and it's not into us. It's not going to let us play. And so it's like sisters, brothers, themsters, like let's make a different future. This is not who we're going to be in solidarity with. It's never going to work out for us. You know, the LGBT center becomes this like ideal space, right, in Greenwich Village that you can always go to, and there's always space, but you can't stay. It's the same thing in Greenwich Village. Like, who gets to remain? You know, totally. Sorry.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then I'm just going to encourage the audience, the participants, to be thinking about any questions that you want to pose to Brandi and Jack after this last round of chat.
I have a question for Jack after that, but then that's it.
What?
And then I have a question for Jack after you're done.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So this is a question about mobility. So like for me, I think, you know, we can't talk about queerness, Blackness, and cities in the US without talking about movement, confinement, circulation, forced displacement, right? And so Brandi, this comes through a lot in your chapter on public space and its discussion of the relationship of Black bodies to the street on this gentrifying commercial strip. And then Jack, you know, for you, like the movement of your participants through urban space was really central to the way that you theorize constellations and the kind of queering of space. And so, again, this is just can you each talk about this? Can you talk about the importance of travel, circulation, mobility, and immobility in how you theorize the relationship between like difference, whether that's Blackness or queerness, and urban space?
Yeah, you know, thank you for that question, because mobility was a really big idea for me to work through, even from my dissertation. That last chapter was literally 2 paragraphs in my dissertation that I knew I wanted to blow up and make bigger. And it was because of this question of circulation and mobility and immobility. And so why it mattered, and still to me matters so much, is because, well, a couple of things. I do use the term Black bodies in that chapter a lot. And I'm clear about why, because I know that a lot of people in Black studies and generally scholars don't like the term Black bodies and instead would prefer Black people. And I use it intentionally because of the ways that the state has produced these subjects as these Black bodies literally representing diversity. And so along H Street, there's this, in the center of the corridor, I talk about how 8th and H is the highest bus transfer point in the city, and that the Department of Transportation had no intention of moving it. So in this way, it produces this inherent form of diversity by having all the poor and working class Black people travel through the corridor, not stay, because they got rid of the services and the other types of retail that they would have gone to. But instead, it is literally a place where they can hang out momentarily. And so they were Black bodies for the purpose of that corridor, for the purpose of that planning, right? And so I was very intentional about it and about describing why I used it in that context, why the Blackness accrued a certain kind of value to bring in the story of diversity. So what that means is Black people's needs are not addressed. Instead, it's kind of, again, the Black body is in service of capital and really kind of what's going on throughout the city. So the tension, of course, is how do Black bodies circulate, right? And they circulate on the bus, or the coolness, right? Right. And I see the question, Fuchsia's here. The marketing of Black cool, right? So this is the way that the Black body functions here. But there isn't the same kind of agency unless it's an entrepreneurial, this neoliberal subject that can have a juice bar or who's able to, have a stand that necessarily reflects this kind of future making of a cool Blackness or a sanitized Blackness. So I still think about that particular idea. I still think about how Blackness serves a particular purpose in the mobility and circulation of Black people. There was a paper that I never finished with a former colleague of mine, Kate Howell, where we literally, she's a GIS person, I can't do that stuff, but we were marking essentially the bus lines that would leave 8th and H and where they went. And most of them went by housing projects in Washington, DC. So we could literally track where Blackness goes in DC, right? Especially from this point in this kind of gentrifying space. Now, since the book's been published, the area that was there, the strip mall that was there is no longer there. It's now this high-end mixed use building where they have it's not SoulCycle, it's one of the other ones. One of the exercise places and very expensive other things. But, of course, it's this high-end, nice, multi-story building. And so it's even more jarring to see Black people waiting for the bus, sitting on milk crates, chilling and talking to each other when you have this monstrosity that's there. So the mobility is really about, again, the circulation of the Black body in that kind of environment, and less about, an Orange Theory, yes, thank you, less about the actual kind of movement of people to be able to transition and go throughout the corridor. And so that's where, like, when I did follow up and do the article on go-go music, I'm hoping to think about the ways that the music can permeate this space, right? That if you don't necessarily have the people able to go where they want, at least the music can infiltrate really the space and the buildings. It was so loud that it was really kind of penetrating the buildings. And to me, that was really important. It's like, yeah, piss them off, like, rattle them, because for some reason, they're going to rely on basically the color and culture that, Blackness indexes, and instead not really focus on the needs that we have. So yeah, I still write about mobility. It's never going to go away for me. So, but in that context, that's what it meant.
That was awesome. And I love the Orange Theory Fitness, but yeah, also the Whole Foods, there's this great chapter that you write about Whole Foods. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm totally teaching this. Whole Foods and more so Trader Joe's showed up on our maps, right? Like this affordable place, but put in very, very, very specific locations, and the targeting of that. So thinking about mobility, like the F train corridor is like, it's just like it's the historic path of lesbian queer gentrification throughout the city. You can always find a lesbian on the F train, or queer or dyke or trans person for that matter, 100%. And that's because it goes through Greenwich Village, it goes through Midtown where a lot of people work, and then it scoots out, Lower East Side, you're headed towards Park Slope. You're going to Ditmas Park, you're going into Queens. And so many people reference the F train as this kind of like, well, of course, take the F train. And like realizing how central it was to be connected to one another, or this imaginary of places, or these actual places, like how many places show up on Midtown. When I actually mapped everything, I didn't realize how many day and night geographies were different. I didn't realize how much we're using Midtown at night, because who wants to, it's the most boring place in the world. So like, why would, of course that's where queers are going to find affordable places to like rent in the middle of the night. But I think for my participants, it was also the immobilities of where you can't go, like how you had to rearrange your route. like participants over 10 years talked about this cat collar down the street from the LGBT center. And so if you want to go to Cubbyhole or Henrietta's, the two remaining lesbian bars in Manhattan, you're going to have to walk on the other side of the street. All the femme women knew this, right? And trans people. And that reproduced this kind of like ways of navigating that they thought they were angry about, but they, it's like, oh, well, it's the city and somebody's going to catcall me. Also thinking about what you can or can't do is certain racialized, classed, gendered bodies. Like, where are you going to hold hands if you're butch or you're trans masc, and to what ends? And you're trans femme. My gosh, I didn't interview trans women, but of course. And one of my participants, Trey, who came out in 2003, talked about like I grew up in Crown Heights and said I'm Black up to Grand Army Plaza, this major kind of it looks like a transportation node. It's just like a large traffic circle, and the Brooklyn Library is there. And then I'm gay thereafter. And they're talking about going through like very white liberal neighborhoods who pride themselves in the cosmopolitanness of accepting queer people. And so like, okay, well now you're going to accept me and I'm going to fuck shit up in front of you because you want me to do this. You want me to be queer and I can do this, but I can't be Black with you. Like, you don't want to see that. You want to see me be queer. And how that constant awareness and the constant labor of being aware of where you went. One of my participants was like, I would wear whiteness on my body when I went home when people say, where's your man? And she's like, I would pick my nose. I would talk like a white person. I would wear really baggy clothes. And I'm like, my God, like this every day of this woman's life, because as someone who's butch, like listening to femme people share these stories about navigating cities. And I don't write about butches enough. Like that was an awkward space for me. It's not as much anymore. We'll see if I can do it, Brandi. I'll be with you in the can we do these things kind of thing. But yeah, I think like thinking about femininity through the city, there was all this stuff about women's fear of public space, all this great work that Rachel Payne and others had done for years. And that really inspired my work. I was like, but I walk around and I'm 6 foot tall and I'm kind of big and I'm funny. And, I once walked through Times Square and I had my scarf on and my hat pulled down and like, hey, big guy, want to come in here to the porn theater? And I was like, oh my God, did that just happen? And I was like, not the masculinity I was looking for. This is not the masculinity you're looking for. This is gross. And trying to like represent what queerness looks like. And also something that came up was like a dyke nod, right? Like when you see another queer person on the street or someone you think is, and just like recognizing each other, like how important that was to sustain yourself. So I think the mobilities were really important. And Finn Enke wrote that great book, Finding the Movement, about 70s lesbian spaces, like in the upper Midwest. And they said, okay, so all the archives are about places, but my participant stories are travel stories. It's like, how did you get there and back? And especially, women and trans people are constantly conscious of how you get anywhere and any time. So they kept telling these stories. And yeah, it was so normal to me to hear those stories that like when I was reading again with Cindy Katz, we're reading the transcript. She's like, they're just talking about their bodies all the time. And I was like, are they? Oh gosh, I guess we do that. Like it wasn't, it was something where you're so saturated and you can't see it until there's so much of it. So yeah, the mobilities things really structures my work.
Can I ask my question since it actually is related? Yes. Yay. So it's a mess, my question, because it's what I scribbled all over. I think it's chapter 4, the you versus us in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. That's it. Okay. So what was interesting, what I kept going back to is I'm reading this chapter to see how you write about Black lesbian life in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. And it seemed as though how we are to see, as a reader, to see their lives is always in relation to the encroachment of white people, essentially, right? And so it ends up being that so much of it, and really this just might be the case in understanding, like when you're doing ethnography or when you're interviewing people, that so much of it is, on the one hand, you defining your life, where you go, and especially thinking about these maps that are produced, right? I'm looking, it was hard to see in the book, the drawings, but you can go online and see that. But to see kind of how they're able to navigate these different spaces. But then at the same time, there are these ways that it's kind of like, ugh, we have to deal with the white lesbians all over again because, right? And these ways that their white guilt are encroaching. So it's not even that they're taking up space physically, but literally like they're trying to be inclusive and they are encroaching on even the ability to exist when especially like 40% of the Black folks in these areas are from other countries, our first gen or our second gen, right? And so there are all these, so I thought about, and I don't know if you've read it, but Orly Clerget's book, where she's talking about Jamaican, African-American, and Haitian folks, middle-class folks in Long Island and parts of Queens, and just the cultural, these cultural challenges, honestly, that you have to really play with and that you have to navigate when you're living in New York in such a diverse Black space. So I'm wondering, I mean, it's kind of a comment, but more of a question, but it's kind of like, is there a way to kind of write about these experiences of these Black women that doesn't necessarily have to focus on encroachment? And that might just be a question generally for work that is involving a more diverse sampling of people. It's always just like, we always have to think about white folks coming. The white folks are coming. And then how do we kind of develop our own identities when we have to constantly be thinking about that particular, and I'm using encroachment on purpose, like, because that's literally, as I'm reading it, that's how I felt. I was like, it's like you feel like they're in the, like, ugh, go away. Like, you don't get this, girl, bye. Like, just, you know? So how did you feel that when you're in these interviews? Were you thinking, okay, yes, I'm seeing you like.
Yeah. I mean, like I was still in the room. I mean, I think that they were starting to share stories. And then I'm sitting there, I'm this white person sitting there. And I had the women of color focus group, which was primarily Black women, all women. And, when I sat there and I started and I was like, how would you like to start? And Wanda, who came out in 1984, who's really the protagonist of the whole book. I think she's the coolest human ever. Yes, you love her too. Yes, she's so funny and brilliant. I sent her the book. I was like, you are the protagonist of my book. Thank you, Wanda. And she is an amazing activist. She has changed New York. So she's dope. I hope she comes out someday as Wanda. She was like, tell me what you told me. And I was like, what? And she's like, tell me what you told me on the phone when you invited me. And I was like, I think all this shit's fucked up. And I just like started talking and she's like, okay, now we'll talk. I was like, okay. And I was like, I want to make a space for you, but like, obviously you don't want to tell me everything and you're not going to tell me where the girls go. And I think that like, also, you would talk about Crazy Nannies and how amazing Crazy Nanny was and how beautiful it was, but they didn't share those stories with me. And I don't think they should share those stories with me. And there's so little work on Black lesbians. Like Mouths of Rain just came out, this beautiful book that Brianna Jones edited as a Black lesbian. Like the first Black lesbian reader just came out as 2021. Like what the hell? And like, I was using Nikki Lane's dissertation, writing her saying, can I use this? Like, cause you have you want to, like, is it okay? Like, can I show you? She's like, whatever, it's great. But like Nikki Lane's idea, like when she says that Black lesbians in DC are going out on Tuesday nights so no one harasses them, like that was just like a mic drop about the temporality of Black lesbian lives. Like these things are not written about or talked about to protect themselves, to protect their spaces, to protect their worlds. And then when they do this kind of space where it's a lesbian queer space, it's great up to a point. And then there's some annoying white person every freaking time. And I wanted to like smack white people around and be like, look at the dumb crap you keep fucking doing and shut up and go to training and just shut up and don't show up, like go somewhere else. And so thanks for asking. I have a question for you real fast. There's this, I feel like what you're saying is like also a critique of gentrification wave theory. And I think what you're saying, and tell me if this is right, that there's this just gentrified moment, this gritty edge. And I think what you're saying is that they're manipulating the gentrification wave theory and manipulating Black people and Black spaces to maintain, right? Like to maintain this almost gentrified, not really, right? And I think that's what queer people are definitely kept around for. And look, they're here, they're new, they're the gay gentrifiers, right? So it's a hip neighborhood. And how like all of these identities and bodies feed like neoliberal capital and the real estate state. like they're like our people, like anyway, I want to see what you think about the just gentrify. It felt like there was a temporality.
I want to add something to this too. So, I mean, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what you're saying, Jack. So, so if we think about like rent gap theory, then is the idea that like diversity and like keeping Black people around, like in the way that Brandi was talking about Black bodies, right? That's like a kind of a way of ensuring that the rent gap never actually closes, that there's always this kind of like potential value to be exploited. Is that what you mean?
Through diversity,
Through
diversity.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, Brandi, can you talk to us about this?
That is interesting, as I just taught my undergrads about the waves this past week. So, I mean, they're easy, right? To be able to, when you're teaching about gentrification, here you go. So, yeah, and it's funny because Jason Hackworth was writing how I kind of pushed beyond rent gap theory, and I'm not really kind of buying into, yeah. Mostly because, seriously, I mean, I feel like I'm a broken record. Blackness was central to this project. And so it's kind of like if I start with Blackness and I form everything else around it, then it's whatever is going to be is going to be. And so, in terms of understanding what gentrification felt like, the waves don't do it. The waves don't account for what people are actually experiencing. And that's why I think DC was such a central location to start, because of how, well, first of all, spatially thinking about the role of the federal government and how much land the federal government actually has. And DC being so tiny, it's less than 10 square miles. And then again, being covered by so much federal land. But beyond that, the fact that it has always had a Black mayor, I mean, when they started having mayors, the fact that, there are ways that, again, Black wealth has been accumulated in certain sections of the city, but, intense bouts of Black poverty also, and has been spatialized incredibly so. So I wasn't explicitly pushing against the waves as much as I was making Blackness central to how we think about urban change, and especially in the United States. And I think that is a necessary thing for historians to do. If they're going to go back and think about urban histories, they need to think about what Blackness meant to how people were making decisions about what to do with the city. I teach about industrialization and focus on Blackness. So even if, certainly as we think about immigration, as we think about like literal diversity and people coming from all walks of life, absolutely, that could be formulated. But ultimately, kind of like the initial reasoning, how we created spaces of belonging, how we erected borders and barriers had so much to do with determining what, who, where was Black, and then making decisions based on that. So inherently, gentrification has so much to do with Blackness that it was overwhelming. And so that's the excesses I'm really trying to think about. What happens when Blackness just spills all over? What are we going to do with it? What is the city going to do with it? And these were the ways it did. It made Blackness as part of diversity in order to kind of usher it away when it needed to bring in additional capital to the city to make it grow.
Mm-hmm. This stood out to me because you said something about being sanitized, like the city is sanitized. And I was like thinking of the orange fact, whatever the hell they're called.
Orange theory.
Yeah. Thank you. The orange theories and the cycle use and all those things. And just like how utterly boring they are, and how stale, like the air is stale, and it's air conditioned and they're enclosed, and it's like there's no there. And so yeah.
But anyway. That's actually like, that's an aesthetic, right? Like that, and you can look at the gentrification gray and the neutral colors and the use of brick and wood and stained, and how they paint bricks to look, or paint concrete to look like brick, and all these ways that you make the place look placeless. And to have that be the desired aesthetic is something that's the sanitizing. So it's not necessary. So it's an attempt to make it in weird ways ageographic. That's kind of like abstract space, while still at the same time incorporating it with some kind of value. And so again, it's what Blackness does to that to disrupt it, even though again, these engines are pushing against it. And I'm still trying to figure that out. I mean, it still moves, right? Like it's still moving. I could still be doing work in DC. I don't feel like it, but understanding kind of the context of the Bay Area, understanding Oakland, which again, the percentage of Black folks in Oakland is 24 point whatever percent. but it certainly still has a huge meaning, what it means to be Black in this city, and then also what Blackness has always meant to Oakland at the same time. So, yeah.
Yeah. And one more addition to your question. I mean, that's why I called it A Queer New York. Like, here's one version of it. Like, there are, like, it's just 47 people's stories, right? And let's break open all the ideas you have first and let a million other books follow. Like, that's like, this is just one version. And also because queer history is so little that it, like, people will think this is it. And that was the problem. Like, let me show you all the versions of the things.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. Man, did I rewrite that chapter a few hundred times? So yeah.
No, but I think it's good. I was curious even from the beginning how you were going to talk about it, because when you outline, you know, what you were going to do in each chapter, I was like, this is going to be interesting, because I'm curious how they're responding to, you know, honestly, the gentrifiers talking about how they want to do right, and thinking about, you know, their politics being the right kind of politics, but in these ways, how to make these other women legible. And it's hard to do that even if you possess the right politics. So
yeah. I got a review from Allison Bain, who said, you know, in Antipodes said, this is a great book, and this is the race chapter was about Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. And I was like, the Park Slope chapter is about whiteness. Hey, Tamar, thank you too. Like whiteness, it, like, we need to account for whiteness. Like, you know, dig in, y'all. So
yeah.
So we are very close to the end of our time together. This has been such a gorgeous conversation. We've got into so many nooks and crannies, and we have just a few minutes left, but I'm happy to open the floor to anyone who wants to either speak up and ask a question or write a question in the chat and I can read it out. Anything that you want to ask Brandi and or Jack. Or if you just want to say hi.
Well, I just want to say something because I'm here with a bunch of students from Mills College.
Oh,
and, yes.
Hey, Oakland!
That's Tara. Wait, Tara,
hi, Tara.
Ika, and we're talking about these identities in Oakland. So, I mean, it couldn't be. I'm openly gay elected official there. And I just want to say that it's so critical to have these conversations. And some of the language is brand new to me, so I'm going to get both your books. But I will say is that, do any of you know of any information? Because Oakland is a huge population of queer community.
Yeah.
If you have any of this work inside of our area that we could reference, and because we're having
these
discussions now. Could you get me stuff?
Yeah, totally.
Oh, you rock.
Yeah, totes.
I brought my wife in to listen. That's who came to sit down. She's like, I want to hear what they're talking about. So thank you. So
That's
if you could,
exciting.
Yeah, so we'd love to learn more, and I'll share it with my amazing team members, my sisters from Mills. And so,
oh wow, I grew up not too far from Mills, so yeah.
Hey, Bay Area.
Thank you, Shay.
I just want to chime in as well. I also go to, like she said, I go to Mills. And Brandi, I am in love with your book. I only read 2 chapters of it because of Professor Hernandez. He teaches that book in his gentrification class.
Yep,
I wrote my midterm and my final on deconstructing your theories about gentrification in DC. Wow. And I will tell you, that is a great book. You did an amazing job on just using and telling how Black bodies and Black spaces are used as a commodification. And I am excited to see how you bring that into Oakland, because it's happening here too, girl. And I just cannot wait and see what you do with that.
Thank you so much. I feel, oh man, that was unexpected. Thank you. That means a lot. Wow. Weird. Okay, sorry. Thank you for sharing that. I really appreciate it. It means a lot. And especially, I literally just I gave a guest lecture this morning, and I had a student tell me that the jargon made it hard for them to read the book. And so, you know, and I apologize, because it's like, I want to have it be accessible. But at the same time, I also need a promotion. So I need to write a book that's going to keep me in conversation with some folks. You know, I want students to be able to access it, and I want it to be meaningful, because the ideas behind it are those that I know are familiar. So that just really means a lot. So thank you so much, Tara, for sharing that.
Ms. Summers, I have not yet had a chance to read your book, but it's on my list.
Okay.
However, the themes that you discuss are things that I understand very well because I live in South Central Los Angeles in an area called Lamert, or near an area called Lamert Park, which is like the cultural center of Black LA.
Yeah.
And this commodification of Black bodies and Black culture is happening here. I
Yeah.
went to school in New York City, in Harlem. I went to Columbia University. Same thing was happening there. And while at Columbia as an undergrad, I did my thesis research about this idea of cultural gentrification. And something that I learned from doing my ethnographic work is that this commodification happens both by white developers, but also sometimes by Black institutions that are indigenous to the space, right? Like in Harlem, you have the Abyssinian Baptist Church. And so when I learned that, I'm like, well, what the heck are we supposed to do, right? How are we supposed to maintain these Black cultural spaces in an authentic form when some of the actors who are sanitizing these spaces are from within the community themselves? And so, I'd be interested, I'm not sure what time we're supposed to end, but I'd be interested if there is some time to hear your ideas about how I can help to save my neighborhood and how, we can save neighborhoods similar to Lamert Park in Harlem and other parts of the country.
That's a really wonderful question, Alex. And I try to talk a bit about that as it relates to DC because I don't talk about it explicitly with Howard University, but there are these ways that Howard is contributing to similar things in Washington DC. And so there are also some characters in my book where I'm essentially calling them these perfect Black neoliberal subjects, where ultimately they are trying to bring money and focus on Black entrepreneurs making money, but at the expense of the community. So as much as they're trying to bring in or uplift a particular Black class, they're leaving others behind. And so part of it is, really breaking away from this idea that we have to grow the city constantly, that we just have to keep getting bigger, adding more people, adding more money, right? And instead shift that to understand, how do we get people back to staying? How do you make it so people don't have to leave? And I don't think that the cities are structured, or certainly developers aren't, in a way to make sure they keep people, as if you lose value if they leave. So how do you shift that narrative? And so again, a lot of it, and thinking about various places in Los Angeles and Los Angeles County, there are plenty of folks who are trying to do like the Crenshaw, like the what's Destination Crenshaw and all these other projects. There are a lot of transportation projects and where they're trying to shift the infrastructure, but still a lot of it is around kind of success. And so I think if we shift kind of that profit-minded mentality, of course, it has a lot to do with capitalism and understanding a different way to have our relationship with it. But there are opportunities for mutual aid. There are opportunities to organize and have it so you're not necessarily just focusing on making more and really hoarding kind of what you accumulate. But yeah, let's connect. I'm happy to connect with you to talk to you about that separately. I think that's a great question. And you've done the bi-coastal thing, so you can see where it shows up, in these different spaces. So thank you though for that question.
Thank you.
I think we're over time, and I realize it's later on the East, for those of you on the East Coast. So thank you for sharing the last hour and a half with us. Thank you so much to Brandi and Jack for sharing your amazing work and just digging into a really lovely conversation. And thanks to the Center for Place, Culture, and Politics for hosting all of us today.
Thank you so much for coming. This was great. I can do this kind of stuff more often.
Yeah, thank you all. Thank you, Brandi, for doing this. Thank you, Desiree.
No, of course, Jack. Oh, it was fun. Like seriously, when I was giving my talk, it's like we have to do something together. So
thanks everyone. Oh, thanks for these lovely comments. You guys are great to sit here with us. This is great. We've been so excited about this. I hope we get to write something still. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Well. Yes.
Okay. Yes. I can't wait. We promise to send it to all of you. We'll keep a list. Thank you. Thanks everybody. Is that all good, Mary?
Cool.
Mary's in charge.
Yeah, Mary is in charge.
Oh.
Recording. You want to stop the recording, Mary, or do you want to keep it going?
I'm stopping it.
Okay.
Peace out.